We all bear traces of the starvation struggle which for so long made up the life of the race. Our very organism holds memories and glimpses of that long life of our ancestors which still goes on among so many of our contemporaries. Nothing so deadens the sympathies and shrivels the power of enjoyment as the persistent keeping away from the great opportunities for helpfulness and a continual ignoring of the starvation struggle which makes up the life of at least half the race. To shut oneself away from that half of the race life is to shut oneself away from the most vital part of it. It is to live out but half the humanity to which we have been born heir. My temperament and habit had always kept me rather in the middle of the road. In politics as well as in social reform I had been for the best possible. But now I was pushed far toward the left on the subject of the war, and I became gradually convinced that in order to make the position of the pacifist clear it was perhaps necessary that at least a small number of us should be forced into an unequivocal position. True peace is not merely the absence of war, it is the presence of justice. Nothing could be worse than the fear that one had given up too soon, and left one unexpended effort that might have saved the world. The common stock of intellectual enjoyment should not be difficult of access because of the economic position of him who would approach it. I dreamed night after night that everyone in the world was dead excepting myself, and that upon me rested the responsibility of making a wagon wheel. These young men and women, longing to socialize their democracy, are animated by certain hopes which may be thus loosely formulated, that if in a democratic country nothing can be permanently achieved save through the masses of the people, it will be impossible to establish a higher political life than the people themselves crave, that it is difficult to see how the notion of a higher civic life can be fostered save through common intercourse, that the blessings which we associate with a life of refinement and cultivation can be made universal and must be made universal if they are to be permanent, that the good we secure for ourselves is precarious and uncertain, is floating in mid-air, until it is secured for all of us and incorporated into our common life. What after all, has maintained the human race on this old globe despite all the calamities of nature and all the tragic failings of mankind, if not faith in new possibilities, and courage to advocate them? That which may have sounded like righteous teaching when it was remote and wordy, will be challenged afresh when it is obliged to simulate life itself. In the unceasing ebb and flow of justice and oppression we must all dig channels as best we may, that at the propitious moment somewhat of the swelling tide may be conducted to the barren places of life. The essence of immorality is the tendency to make an exception of myself. In his own way each man must struggle, lest the moral law become a far-off abstraction utterly separated from his active life. Hospitality still survives among foreigners, although it is buried under false pride among the poorest Americans. The settlement is an experimental effort to aid in the solution of the social and industrial problems which are engendered by the modern conditions of life in a great city. It insists that these problems are not confined to any one portion of the city. It is an attempt to relieve, at the same time, the overaccumulation at one end of society and the destitution at the other. Social advance depends quite as much upon an increase in moral sensibility as it does upon a sense of duty. Private beneficence is totally inadequate to deal with the vast numbers of the city's disinherited. We fatuously hope that we might pluck from the human tragedy itself a consciousness of a common destiny which should bring its own healing, that we might extract from life's very misfortunes a power of cooperation which should be effective against them. Of all the aspects of social misery nothing is so heartbreaking as unemployment. If the settlement seeks its expression through social activity, it must learn the difference between mere social unrest and spiritual impulse. Life cannot be administered by definite rules and regulations, that wisdom to deal with a man's difficulties comes only through some knowledge of his life and habits as a whole. This dream that men shall cease to waste strength in competition and shall come to pool their powers of production is coming to pass all over the earth. If the underdog were always right, one might quite easily try to defend him. The trouble is that very often he is but obscurely right, sometimes only partially right, and often quite wrong, but perhaps he is never so altogether wrong and pig-headed and utterly reprehensible as he is represented to be by those who add the possession of prejudices to the other almost insuperable difficulties of understanding him. The task of youth is not only its own salvation but the salvation of those against whom it rebels, but in that case there must be something vital to rebel against, and if the elderly stiffly refuse to put up a vigorous front of their own, it leaves the entire situation in a mist. Civilization is a method of living, an attitude of equal respect for all men. With all the efforts made by modern society to nurture and educate the young, how stupid it is to permit the mothers of young children to spend themselves in the coarser work of the world.